Bayo Akumalafe, who's a Nigerian philosopher. He says our nervous system is not limited to our bodies. The nervous system is forests and rivers and mountains and the past and what is yet to come.
Welcome to Root Shock, the show where we ask what it is to be healthy under late-stage capitalism. I'm your host, Hannah Titus, and today's guest is Dr. Jen Myers. Dr. Myers holds a PhD in sustainability education from Prescott College. She is based at the Eco Village in Ithaca, New York. There, she serves as project director at the Center for Transformative Action, and she collaborates with the Global Eco Village Network on climate resilience initiatives, focusing on how communities can support each other and build resilience in the face of today's ecological polycrisis. This episode is about cultivating courage and the ingredients necessary to be resilient in a rapidly changing world. We hope you enjoy it. So sit down, relax, enjoy a nice cup of tea or a tall glass of water, and enjoy the show. We're talking today about climate anxiety and climate grief. But I think before we dive in, it might be beneficial to define those terms. What is climate anxiety and its companion emotion, climate grief?
There are positive and negative emotions that fall under the experience of the climate crisis. And I think that another overarching term that's useful is climate distress. So it might show up for people in many different ways. We might have anxiety, we might have grief, we might have fear, we might have anger, and at times we have hope and positive emotions. But really, it's the distress that folks are feeling when thinking about the existential dread that is the defining characteristic of the climate crisis. It's in response to a collapse of our sense of normalcy, our sense of safety in the world. And what's really important about it is that it's a natural and normal response to these considerably unsettling times. So it's not characterized as a mental health disorder. And I think it's really critical that we normalize it as a response that makes sense given the enormity of the disruption to our lives and to our sense of what's possible in the future that we're facing.
I know that you have been doing work within your community in cultivating tools for responding to this grief around the climate crisis. What themes do you see emerging in that work?
Well, I really like to focus in on resilience as kind of our core capacity to rebound after crises and to maintain a sense of stability and a sense of self through change. That's what's so definitional about the climate crisis, is that it's about change and it's unpredictable, right? And so we can't pinpoint like this is what we're up against and this is what we can't prepare, right? necessarily for the specifics of how the crisis impacts us. And so thinking about it from the framing of resilience, I think, is an opportunity to lay a foundation for psychological strength and well-being that will be adaptable given a variety of different circumstances and conditions that we might not be able to predict. And so I work a lot with young people in university settings, and there's a lot of hopelessness, I think, and powerlessness that students are expressing, a sense of loss of agency for control over their future. And I'm surprised that I'm not seeing more anger. You know, I think there's frustration with the ineffectiveness of government policy and the failures of older generations' ability to respond to the crisis earlier so that we didn't get to this point that we're at. But on the whole, I'm seeing more powerlessness than frustration, which surprises me. But the focus of the work then was to help them feel a sense of control and agency and think through like what roles they can play, how they can manage their stress, and thinking about psychoeducation is a focus, right? Helping them learn about the window of tolerance and how to gauge their stress levels and tools for managing that.
Could you explain the window of tolerance?
It's a concept that relates directly to resilience, that we have a window where we're optimally functioning. And we can get into a state of hyperarousal when we're overstimulated, overstressed. And that's when we tend to go into like a fight or flight mode. Or we can go into a state of hypoarousal when we're shut down and get into a state that's more tired or exhausted or unable to act. And so the goal of framing things with this lens is to think about the window of tolerance as something that we can grow. But it is something that we can intentionally grow the boundaries of so that we can tolerate more and be functional in a wider window. But it's also a really important tool for thinking about where are your boundaries and recognizing when you're sort of reaching your limits and being able to practice tools to get yourself back into a regulated space where you can function well.
Thank you for that. I really like that expression of the window of tolerance and growing it and strengthening it as a key to resilience. And when you say you're seeing most of the young folks come in with hopelessness, I think of that as the lower end of that window of tolerance. Hopelessness is a very empty feeling. Like, I don't have capacity for movement. Right. I don't have capacity for change, for action. Whereas anger, at least the way I experience it, is the other end of that window, that hyper arousal of like, I am full. Yep. I'm full of heat. I'm full of agitation. Right. And anger is, in its truest form, an action-oriented emotion. Moving anger up and out can be productive, can be very maladaptive as well, if we're not skillful in wielding our anger. But anger by itself can be a motivating factor. And I like what you shared about just expanding that window so that you can find peace close to the edges and recognize where you're tipping out of a space of sustainable regulation in your nervous system into something very unsustainable. And right. I mean, whether you're engaged in activism or not, that becomes important, but especially if you're trying to engage in activist spaces.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I appreciate that framing and the way that you're thinking about it in terms of like the hopelessness versus anger. That's really useful. I hadn't thought of it that way.
I'm thinking about resilience a lot lately too. And it actually, when I think about resilience, I think about that saying, the grass is always greener where you water it. And applied to resilience, I want to ask you, what does resilience mean to you and how do we water it? What is the water that grows healthy resilience? The ingredients that we have to put in so that resilience is sustained.
So the technical definition is really that ability to bounce back and recover. But when I think about it in terms of psychological well-being, there's so much more to it than that. It's a sense of groundedness. It's a sense of safety. It's a sense of empowerment. It's a sense of like courage. And I'm really inspired by folks who are thinking about how do we respond to the climate crisis, not so much in cultivating hope, but cultivating courage. It's not that we need to have success or a guarantee of success. We need to be able to do the hard things, even if there's no guarantee of success. And that's really what it means to me, is being willing to get up and fight that fight every day, regardless of how hopeless it feels. I'm doing a lot of research into what people need to cultivate that sense of bravery and courage to step into things just because it's how we want to live and it's aligned with our values and morals, regardless of the consequences or outcomes. I will say in the research that I've done, the themes that have emerged for me in looking at this question of resilience come down to love, community, and connection as the three main pillars.
Love, community, and connection. Let's hear it. I'm all in.
Yeah. But I was curious with the name of your podcast, being Root Shock. Have you come across Dr. Mindy Fullalove's book, Root Shock?
I am so glad you asked me that because that's exactly what this podcast is named after. This show, Root Shock, is an homage to a book by the same name by social psychiatrist Dr. Mindy Thompson Fullilove. Dr. Fullilove defines root shock as the traumatic stress from community displacement, often caused by, quote, urban renewal projects that destroy Black neighborhoods and the chronic health issues that they engender. It also harkens to the biological trauma that plants experience when torn from the earth. And it points to Indigenous wisdom and values around the trauma of forced displacement and the healing potential of land and community. So this is a great opportunity to introduce this show name early on in its episodes, because really this show is about understanding how our health is political, how our healing is political, and how we can find collective liberation. But in order to do that, we have to acknowledge the ongoing violence against people of color and how all bodies are living in the soup of a colonial, capitalist, and patriarchal world. These are big words. These are heavy words. But I believe that we can approach them with care, with joy, with levity, and through conversation, really find a place of healing and collective liberation together. Now, back to the show. I chose that name because in wellness spaces nowadays, we're all hype for healing. Like, we're hyped for our physical healing. Integrative medicine is cool now. Trauma healing is cool now. Therapy speak is everywhere. But as you and I have mentioned in previous conversations, I think there needs to be a transition to looking upward and saying there are power structures that are impacting our physical and psychological and spiritual bodies every day. And I think that those should be a part of the healing conversation. So yes, I have worked with Dr. Fulilove's work. I put my little fingers on it, and I'm glad that you brought that up.
Excellent.
Please keep going. I'm all in. Love, community, and connection.
Yes. So
ingredients for resilience.
So I leaned on her work quite considerably in research, which I did a community of Vieques in Puerto Rico, which is a small islands community off the coast of mainland Puerto Rico. And it's a community that has been colonized by many different colonial powers over the years and is now in a relationship with the United States. And in the 40s, right before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy usurped, I think it was 75% of the island, which was mostly in sugarcane plantations at the time, and was going to create a military space for ships to dock and refuel, basically. And then Pearl Harbor happened and they pivoted, right? Because they didn't want to concentrate the naval ships. And so they annexed all this land and moved the civilian population into the center of the island. And then they used part of the island for military training operations, both U.S. forces and NATO forces. And then they used the other half of the island as a storage facility for artillery. And so I was really curious about why people stayed under the circumstances, why people fought for their land, and what made people want to fight for their place, right? What is it that connects us to land, even when we're under such traumatic threat, facing like tremendous power differentials? It's the U.S. military against like fishermen in little skiffs, right? It's a kind of classic David and Goliath story. What makes people willing to put their bodies on the line for their love of place? And so I leaned heavily on Dr. Fulham's work in this study, and she has a definition or an ingredient, I guess, of resilience, saying that it's in the act of rebuilding place connection and in maintaining place connection, it's community practices of love that are at the heart of placemaking. And to me, that really gets to the questions of love, of community, and of connection, right? It's how do we define our spaces? How do we embody practices that make alive our relationships to land, that breathe health, I think, into culture, into community? And so that's really what I saw there, is a reclaiming of the narrative of what happened to the place and the stories that were told about relationships to the land there.
So the people that were able to cultivate resilience and have the courage to fight for their space were people that had a strong sense of connectedness to their local community as well as the land around them. Is that right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And there are so many beautiful stories that came out of it. There were these amazing transformations of military spaces. There was a military checkpoint that was a gate that was the boundary of where people were allowed to go during the years of military occupation. And some environmental activists and educators brought children out and used their handprints to make a representation of a ceiba tree. And so it was making a tree out of the handprints of the community's children as a mural to transform this like cement gate that had been a symbol of exclusion and removal from their land, just really changing the meaning of spaces.
That is such a good example of how art is resistance, and such a beautiful demonstration of reclaiming ownership, like physically placing the handprints of the next generation on this symbol of colonial power and military might.
Right. So much of what was really beautiful about that story was around this artist's relationship with the ceiba tree. And she shared with me, like, she was struggling physically with some health issues, as so many Vietnamese are, because they have very high cancer rates on the island because of the military. Well, I shouldn't say because of the military activities. It has not been officially linked to the military activities, but they have a 37% higher cancer rate on Vieques than they do in mainland Puerto Rico. So she was navigating health challenges and went to this beautiful old growth ceiba tree that had been really neglected, and there was a lot of trash and a lot of weeds, and just it was an overgrown, neglected space. And she went there and spoke to the tree and made a pact with this tree and said, if you will heal me, I will heal you. And she did. It was amazing. She created this environmental education movement. She created a park. She engaged the community in all the rehabilitation of the space, and she got better as well. And so it was this beautiful sort of interspecies relationship that supported the health of both entities in their relationship. And very, very inspiring story.
And again, an example of relationship that is reciprocal. Yeah, please help me and I can help you, rather than the dominant Western framework, which is to frame nature as a series of extractable resources to whom we owe nothing, which of course couldn't be further from the truth, particularly if you take in stride the wisdom, guidance, and leadership of Indigenous peoples. That she was able to build those movements in partnership with her tree and her land. I really love the quote that you included at the beginning of this research body. It's a quote by Janelle Baker, and it reads, "If you want to know how to weather the coming storms, look to the people who have had to defy their governments to survive. Listen to their stories." What made you include that quote, and how do you feel it interweaves with the work that you did in Puerto Rico?
I'm so inspired by that quote. I mean, it speaks to the idea of how I think entwined resilience and resistance are. And the fact that so many communities have endured so much and have been forced to develop resilience, right? And so it's not necessarily something to valorize. It's something that's been put upon so many communities that have faced environmental injustice or injustice in general at the hands of colonial powers. And in so many cases, those communities' voices have been silenced or marginalized. So I think as a white descendant of settler colonizers living in the United States, and have long grappled with my role in this kind of work of what it means to reclaim place and sense of place, and as someone that isn't native to this land or whose people are not native to this land. And so I feel really compelled to approach this work very humbly and to learn from the communities who have been forced to develop resilience at the hands of our government. And it's an essential piece of this work, is really to approach it with humility and to uplift the voices of people who've been silenced.
Absolutely. Thank you for naming that and sharing that, because I can absolutely resonate with that as another white person. Like, I too am in process actively every day trying to figure out, when do I step forward? When do I step back? When do I step aside? And how can I be in right relationship and employ my privilege and power in an ethical way? And that's an ongoing journey. And I wish that more people had the courage, like you, to be honest about being in process with that. I do think that an important key in what you've just named is to not valorize the resilience in this context and rather to take it in its whole context. Yeah, because certainly in white wellness spaces, there is a tendency to fetishize Indigenous knowledge. And it doesn't matter if we are in the psychedelic space, in the herbalism space, in the meditation space. Like, this applies to Indigenous communities around the world and the way their knowledge has been extracted for capitalist profit. And there's a real tendency to soften the edges and say, we're going to take the love and light portions that we like, and we're going to remove the critical context that this resilience was cultivated in the face of violence, oppression, and colonial power. And we shouldn't soften that edge. Let's look towards the light. Let's look towards the joy. Let's look towards the fruit of resilience that has come forth from that oppression. But we can't lie about the histories that we're all still playing out the wounds of.
Yep.
So I really appreciate you just calling name to that and calling space to that. Those legacies that are still very real right now. And as you said, they're still very real on the island in which you worked.
Yeah, I'd like to name a tension that is at the forefront of my thinking about this that's really challenging. And I think it connects back to that question about climate anxiety as a diagnosable disorder, right? I'm really compelled by the idea that climate distress or climate anxiety is a form of environmental injustice, right? It's a form of violence that's being perpetrated on us. And I think that's a really important framing to be thinking about and advocating for change, especially for young people that are entering into this world with these conditions put upon them. And yet I do have some reticence to fully lean into that idea of this being a form of environmental injustice because, I mean, obviously it's not happening equally to all of us. There are still considerable inequalities.
It is not happening equally to all of us.
It just points to, I think you understand this and spoke to this well, that there's just so much nuance required in these conversations, right? And so in the United States, a young white activist's environmental distress is quite different than someone in a frontline community in sub-Saharan Africa who's just lost all their cattle that their family depends on, right? And so we're having very inequitable experiences of it, and yet it's still very viscerally real for all of us that are experiencing it.
Absolutely. The climate polycrises are a problem for everybody that isn't the top 0.01% of humanity, and it is disproportionately felt in many communities, as you've just shared, the health impacts in particular, which I think we're going to do a whole other episode on how the climate crisis impacts different communities disproportionately. You've spoken on environmental justice and injustice here and how that justice is unequally felt. How does environmental racism play into these stories and experiences?
We have disproportionately created sacrifice zones, created lands that have been seen as spaces that are just going to be degraded and that we're going to exploit and pollute. Naomi Klein names this in her film, that when we have sacrifice zones, there's an implication that there are people that are sacrificed as well. And that's the history of environmentalism that's coupled with colonialism throughout our history. And that remains true in the face of the climate crisis. So they're one and the same in my mind. There's a nuance to this conversation that I haven't quite unpacked yet, but that I was trying to kind of point to with that, the trickiness of calling this an environmental injustice, because the experience of communities that are at the front lines, communities of color, Indigenous communities around the world, are bearing the brunt of all kinds of environmental degradation, resource exploitation, and human exploitation. And we see that in terms of health impacts. And I've been really compelled recently to be thinking about that in terms of relationships to the land and how critical that is to mental health and well-being in some of the Indigenous communities. So when land is threatened. Health and well-being of human communities is threatened as well. And the story of people who are living more privileged lifestyles and benefiting from the histories of settler colonialism, like it's just a different beast on these days in terms of Indigenous thinkers. I've been really inspired by the Eternal Song film series. It's a series of 12 films that are being released over the course of the year. And the filmmakers interviewed Indigenous healers around the globe and thinking about this rift that colonialism has caused in terms of our relationship to the land and how that's impacting our relationships with the earth and how that's causing so much environmental destruction these days. And so it's sort of unpacking the legacies of colonialism and how that impacts cultures and tying it all into the environmental crisis that we're facing. And so there's been a lot of really, really beautiful lessons coming out of those films. So there's a couple of pieces from that I wanted to bring into the conversation. I'm really inspired by Bayo Akumalafe, who's a Nigerian philosopher. And he says our nervous system is not limited to our bodies. The nervous system is forests and rivers and mountains and the past and what is yet to come. And so there's all these conversations in these films about what health means and how we can restore it by looking to Indigenous communities' connections to the land and sense of self and sense of identity and how much that is tied to a sense of kinship with the natural world.
Absolutely. I'm glad you shared that quote because it's really speaking to my heart. And this is what movements around planetary health are all about, right? Is understanding this reciprocal relationship and necessary mutual health between planet and human well-being, that we cannot be well while the earth is sick.
Right.
And vice versa. And we have plenty of evidence for this. There is no shortage of global health publications. Just yesterday, a new article was published in a medical journal about how women in Sierra Leone are feeling the disproportionate brunt of heat waves, of water shortages, of impacts to their fertility because of climate change. But you don't really need a medical paper to tell you that you can't really be well if the soil, the water, the air has all been poisoned. And I hope to bring our collective community away from this idea that if you have the privilege of purchasing power, that you can buy yourself a fancy water filter, that you can import some clean soil, that you can clean your water and you can bring in some organic vegetables just for you. And move towards a collective responsibility of, wouldn't it be great if we just realigned ourselves with the idea that there is enough if we all take collective responsibility for stewarding this space? And of course, collective responsibility does necessitate that we look to who is actually doing the extraction and the exploiting. And hint, hint, their name starts with B and ends with illionaires. We exist under the legacies of settler colonialism, and in our bones is this wisdom that we can come back to. We can't bypass the history of violence. We can't live with the fruits of that exploitation unquestioningly. We have to surrender some power, and we have to do a lot of work to unravel those things, but also recognize that we're a part of that wisdom as well.
Early on, right, I struggled to understand how to use my power and privilege in an appropriate way in this space, and like concerns about cultural appropriation have been at the forefront of my mind throughout this work. And I really appreciate you raising that, because I've just recently, and again through these conversations around these Eternal Song films, just recently started to kind of lean into that fact that I'm not searching for Indigenous wisdom that's outside of my own cultural heritage, right? It's exactly like you said, we have it in our lineages as well. And I think it's a really important part of that story of colonization and loss and violence. Like, where are the true healers? And we're a part of European cultures as well. We're the people who knew the plants, who could teach us how to be healthy. And without those mentors in U.S. mainstream culture, I think it's really hard to navigate mainstream healthcare systems because we're missing those guides in our lives. But I've really come to see that that's what I'm looking for, and that is not cultural appropriation. I have those roots within my body and within my bones, like you said. So I really appreciate you bringing that lens.
Do not look outside of yourself for a leader.
Yeah, exactly.
Do not look outside of yourself for a leader. There is a leader in each of us, and accessing that leadership in an ethical way that has integrity requires a lot of courage, because it takes courage to navigate these thorny spaces. I mean, people are going to have to see me stumble and fall and be so bad at this. And I'm sure in a week, in a month, and definitely in a year, I'm going to look back at this and say, oh my gosh, what a cringe moment that is. I can barely stomach.
But it's a journey, right? Yep.
But we have to be able to navigate these things. It's a journey because, as we mentioned earlier in our conversation, we can't talk about resilience without talking about resistance. And we can't move forward in hope and in light without honoring, healing, and accounting for the unbearable violence that has been done and continues to be done. We have to be able to hold both. We have to be able to hold all of these multiplicities in one truth and in one body. And that is tricky to do. That is tricky to do. When you talked about the ingredients of resilience being love, community, and connection, it made me think about the young people that you're working with. I am a younger millennial myself, right on the cuspy cusp. So, eye creams are being marketed to me. I am in my elder millennial era, and I am super addicted to my phone. And we did a whole episode last month about phone addiction and how it is absolutely an instrument of the oppressor to keep you dopamine wrecked in cycles of consumption and consumerism. And this had me thinking when you mentioned that you're seeing a lot of hopelessness and lethargy and overwhelm in young people, because in our cell phone connectedness, in our internet hyperconnectivity space that so many of us live in right now, especially younger generations that are chronically online, there's an isolation taking place. And there's already been a lot said about the loneliness epidemic and an isolation epidemic. But I want to take it a step further, because it sounds like, based on what you're sharing, when we're locked in to this digital virtual community, we are actually really prevented from being in physical community and prevented from being in community to land and in relationship with land. And I'm curious what you think about this, particularly based in the lessons that you've learned from your fieldwork in Puerto Rico, and what it might mean, what the implications are. If we need love, community, and connection to be resilient, then how does being on the internet help or hurt that process?
I have a real bias for a less tech-intensive lifestyle. I think rebuilding those relationships, rebuilding the skills to be in relationship, right, is part of the conversation that we're having. Like in my work at the Eco Village at Ithaca, that's part of the focus. It's like, what does it mean to be in community with each other? How can we support each other? How can we nurture real relationships that matter in our lives? And I think it's part of my own personal journey to learn to be in kinship with the larger natural world and to be slowing down, to be more present in the moment. And I just notice the gifts that are all around us. And that's just not something that I have. Again, I don't have like a cultural inheritance that has taught me how to do that. And I think, like you said, so much about mainstream U.S. culture right now is going in the opposite direction, with an emphasis on technology, with an emphasis on efficiency, with an emphasis on capitalist goals. So that's where the resistance is, really, is saying, is this what we value? Is this what we want our lives to be like? And if not, what alternatives can we cultivate? Human relationships and relationships with the more than human world.
To slow down, to be present, and to hold gratitude for what you already have are three terms that are very antithetical to the precepts of capitalism. Whether we like it or not, we are living in a capitalist world. And that's what this podcast is about, is how that affects our health. And we're seeing that it's bringing people a lot of anxiety, a lot of chronic stress, because it is out of accordance with what is sustainable for a human body and for an eco body, a planetary body. It's not sustainable either. So I realize this may be a challenge to pare down, but What practices or resources are in your climate anxiety toolbox, as it were, that you could recommend to listeners to just get them started when they start to fall down this pit of existential dread about the planet we're living on and the direction things are going?
I mean, I think being out in nature is sort of the obvious one, right? Taking time to be outside and be present and be grounded, right? And just started learning to like take my shoes off and feel the earth beneath my feet. And it could be finding a special space that's your, find a tree that you connect with that you can build a relationship with over time. It could be gardening, getting your hands in the soil and interacting directly with the natural world. It could be something like bird watching or, whatever it is that fills your soul. Having an intentional practice of spending time outdoors, I think, is really essential in rebuilding both the patience and the ability to see what we've lost in those relationships that build our health and well-being and help us regulate our nervous systems. When thinking about it in terms of climate change, I think just being in the presence of how beautiful the world is right now, and that there's so much that's worth saving, there's so much that's worth fighting for. Like, you need to be able to see and hold gratitude for the beauty in the world in order to understand what keeps that courage alive to keep fighting. Because it's so easy to get lost in hopelessness of how awful things are. But if you can stay grounded in the beauty of now, I think that serves us really well. And then the other piece that I want to mention is that's something that's new to me and it's really serving me well is art and getting out of my head. Like, I intellectualize so much of my climate anxiety by being an academic and studying it and looking into all the theory. And
so real. Academia is my cope.
I want to have these, really deep conversations about it. And
same, sis.
Exactly. And so, like, how often do folks like me allow ourselves to really feel it and metabolize the grief? And so I found in my work with students, I facilitate these lessons and then I participate in them, and I just can feel it in my body, the benefits that I'm gleaning from the experience. As in a concrete example, we did a session on environmental injustice and climate justice and looked at videos of communities that are on the front lines in the Pacific climate warriors who are losing their homes to sea level rise. And then we got out some paint and colored pencils and used the Climate Mental Health Network's Climate Emotions Wheel, which helps people identify their feelings around climate anxiety, and it's color coded. And so we used the color framings in our art to just process our feelings around like our implications as Westerners in the stories of these people losing their homelands. And it was really cathartic to be able to just draw and feel and not be so stuck in my head at the moment. So, and that's the feedback I've gotten from students too, is that they really, really appreciate the opportunity to be creative and to use that as a way to synthesize their emotional responses to stuff that's so overwhelming and really needs a container.
I mean, art is inherently transformative. I love that, as getting out of our heads and into our bodies, especially using our bodies to create dance, visual arts, collective art projects in group like you shared. That's a beautiful tool. And I'll link to that Climate Emotions Wheel in the show notes. The piece that you mentioned about going out in nature and being present, it made me think of this concept of environmental amnesia, this idea that each new generation has a different reference point for what a healthy, wild nature looks like, and that my memories of what pristine nature looks like are very, very different than my grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather, and what they knew nature to be, especially as we go back to times of colonial expansion across the western frontier of Turtle Island. And it really connects to the importance of oral histories, I think. Like, oral histories have been a part of humanity for a lot longer than written histories have. through language extermination and forced assimilation, unfortunately, a lot of oral histories have been lost through colonization on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think of what is happening right now in the political climate we're living in. We are seeing written histories often erased. We're seeing government pages of female astronauts deleted, right? We're seeing old language of inclusion and equity be erased from the internet. And it makes me think about the resilience of oral histories and how continuing to tell stories of the natural world as it is and as it can be in itself could potentially be resistance making. But in order to be a story carrier, in order to be someone that tells those stories, we must first be able to witness. And that's what you were getting at with spending time with nature. How can you carry the story of who nature was and who she has been if you haven't spent time with her?
Right.
Yeah, if you haven't just spent slow time being present. And so I like what you shared there, because it's making me think of what it means to be a good ancestor and what we're carrying forward and what ingredients are necessary in the now to carry those stories forward. And I can't do that locked up in my bedroom, isolated from the trees and birds outside.
Right. Or on your phone, right? Yeah.
Or on my phone. I love my phone. I have a toxic relationship with my phone. This is really unhealthy. I'm trying so hard.
Yeah, I think it makes me think back to the conversation that we had about how we're all products of colonized culture. We're all products of colonization, right?
It's the soup we're living in.
Rebuilding those relational connections with nature is something that is part of the work of decolonizing ourselves, and relearning how to be in relationship with the natural world and claiming that as a birthright that is essential to our health and well-being, I think is so important. And I do want to bring it back to the conversation about climate anxiety or climate distress being a diagnosable disorder. It's a manifestation of these times, right? I don't think that it should be classified as a sickness beyond the fact that like it's a symptom of a cultural sickness, of a planetary unwellness. Like you said, like how can we be well if the earth is not well? So why pathologize and put that diagnosis on an individual when it's
exactly
a systemic problem?
Yeah. When we treat climate anxiety like an individual pathology, we place the onus of blame, treatment, care, and healing on the individual. And it completely shifts ownership from where it should be. It shifts ownership from collective movement makers against power holders that bring us to this situation every day. It completely erases justice and environmental racism from the conversation. And it turns it into something that, I hope not, but could be medicatable.
Right.
I don't want to see people with climate anxiety get a prescription. And I hope we're very far away from that. But I see the pathway that could potentially unfold in the realm of commercializing and pathologizing this natural symptom and natural reaction to crisis and grief.
Right. And it points us, like you said, to the onus being on the individual to figure out how to heal rather than healing in community, right? Rather than leaning on each other and recognizing that this is a symptom of systemic problems that we need to work collectively to resolve.
One of my favorite quotes from a mentor of mine, Dr. Arturo Ornelas, who is a leader in the curandero and curandera community in Cuernavaca, Mexico. He shares that healing was never meant to be silent. Healing is never done in a quiet room in isolation. It is always meant to be something done in community and in relationship. And I hope that we can all find our way back to that, to recognizing that healing happens in relationship to other humans, to the land that we're on, to the grass, the trees, the birds, the air, and also healing the different relationships within self. You know, as you and I have touched on, these relationships that we have to our own ancestors whose actions we find deplorable. And finding ways to heal those relationships as they're playing out in violence in communities today.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is healing in relationship, all of it, across time and across space and across species.
Okay. Beautifully said.
Always keeping it honest, always keeping it courageous.
It's the goal, right?
Even to the point of embarrassing myself. That is the goal. That's every day I'm trying to lean in. I'm like, okay, if I can just stomach the fact that I will be cringe in order to grow and be in process, then that's just what we're going to have to do.
No, I appreciate it.
Well, Jen, I'd like to wind us down, Jen. So in our final moment here, I could do this all day, but we got places to be.
I'm excited to have this conversation with you. So let's continue it.
To leave us off today, what words of wisdom would you like to leave with the listeners who will hear your voice on this podcast?
I'm at a point in my journey where I'm working to really embody this idea of healing as a collective and healing in community, and that's how we get to resilience. Like, resilience should not be an individual responsibility that anyone carries, so we do it together. And that ties it back to what gives me courage to keep in this fight, that I'm not alone in this, that I don't have to have all the answers, that I don't have to solve everything or carry it all on my shoulders. I have so many ancestors and guides and neighbors who see the beauty in this world and are willing to fight for it alongside me. And that's the seat of my courage to do this work. I think keeps me going every day.
Well said. Thank you so much, Jen, for sharing this conversation with me, for getting vulnerable, and for sharing your wisdom and experiences. I'm super grateful.
It's really wonderful to be able to talk about this stuff in a very real and honest way. So thank you.
That's our show, everyone. Thanks for listening, for holding space for vulnerability, for courage, and for resilience. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't miss the chance to like, subscribe, leave a little comment, let us know how we're doing. And until next time, may you all rest, resist, and use your gifts. Bye for now.